Talking with Steve Goldstein of Amplifi Media, post Podcast Movement 22 in Dallas. Your takeaways, Steve. I'd want to run through you're the only person I know who has not written a blog with takeaways from Podcast Movement. Therefore, I have to get you on the horn here and get you to tell me, because apparently you're not going to write it. So here we go. And I think
I'm feeling
what's
bad.
That? You're feeling what?
I'm feeling bad. I should have written a blog along with all the other 20,000 other Podcast Movement bloggers. But there are some big takeaways, no doubt. I mean, I would say the one that came up the most is about video, specifically YouTube. And, given that this used to be an Apple world and now it's an Apple Spotify world and now it's an Apple Spotify YouTube world, what the YouTube strategy is, there was a lot of different suggestions, ideas, and thoughts on that. And I think that's kind of appropriate because I don't think this is a one and done sort of thing. Yeah, get your podcast up on YouTube and you're done. There is that video component. I come out of the radio business. You come out of the radio business. We all put the cameras in the studio and watch that miserable thing unfold where bad video is not accretive to the business. So I think it has to be the right thing presented the right way, and I don't think that's going to be decided right away. I also think it's going to be different for different podcasters. So very bespoke strategies need to be created for video.
One of the things that I think every podcaster who tries video has to decide is which medium is going to be primary. Is it going to be audio? Is it going to be video? Because you have to play to one or the other primarily. The kinds of edits that we do in audio are brutal to be seen as jump edits in video, for example. And yet there are people who are firmly in the podcasting business, like Cast Media, that have from the start had TV studios installed alongside their audio studios. And they tend to have a lot of influencer type hosts who do very well with their video versions. So as you say, case by case situation. Is it not, the discussion about video, is it not part of a larger overall trend in media in general where there's a bit of a merging of all platforms? Video is becoming more interactive, just like, taking a page from, I guess, video games ultimately and devices like that. For that matter, people say that movies, Netflix, home theater experiences are going to be more interactive in the future. Media seems to be merging, and that's probably true in some ways of audio and video as well.
Yeah, I think all of that is true, but it depends on what your mission is. So, for example, I was moderating the podcast leadership session, and one of the people on the session was Jessica Cordova-Kramer, who was the president of Lemonada. And she said, we do a lot of narrative stuff that just doesn't lend itself to video.
Yep.
So you won't find us doing that on the narrative stuff. Well, that makes sense. And I do think it makes a difference whether this is intended to be an audio podcast or whether there is a visual component. And that's why I do think everything needs to be pretty bespoke. I mean, you could spend a lot of time creating visual accoutrements that may not make sense for the experience and may not be accretive.
I forget who it was. Someone referred to videos like the one that we're doing right now as being hostage videos. Love that. If you want to hold up today's newspaper, go ahead, Steve. So
right.
Part two, another potential takeaway that I'll see if you agree about is other platforms beyond YouTube. YouTube had representation, and that was part of the video discussion that we've been talking about, but also changes to the Twitter app, to how Spotify and other platforms are presenting, suggesting podcasts.
So the graveyard is loaded with apps for podcasts. Most of them have not survived. I mean, there was even the Mark Cuban thing down at the conference, now moving more into video. I think the Twitter thing makes some sense just intuitively. I think it feels like they have a reasonable shot at it. I've now seen what they call audio when you click into the Twitter Spaces module. I think it has a long way to go. It feels very 1.0. It doesn't take me to my podcast. It takes me to their recommendations. So that's another way to expose podcasts, but it's not necessarily the app that people would use to listen to podcasts. So we'll have to see how that evolves. Having said that, I'm happy to see them in the space, but I was also happy to see Facebook in the space, and that didn't work out too well. So I do think that they're going to have to figure out their raison d'etre. Why are we involved in podcasting, and where does it fit?
You and I talk a lot about branded podcasts. We have worked on and will again projects together. So it's somewhat self-serving to ask this question, but any takeaways about branded podcasts?
So it seems to be a hot topic. There are a lot of shops that are springing up and doing branded audio, and some of them are doing a very nice job with it. But I do think it remains the hardest category in all of podcasting. And why do I say that? Because most people don't want to interact with brands. Most people want to be entertained, they want to be informed, but going to a brand is a really high calling. So there has to be something special there, and the content has to be right. And the marketing, I think, is a critical component. You and I have experienced that. The marketing makes a big difference. So my overall view of branded is there could be companies that do it and get burned and don't come back to it. So I do think it matters how this stuff rolls out. Having said that, there are a lot of companies who are interested in it. Obviously, that's a good thing for us, but we'll see where that nets out. It's like everything else. It all depends on execution, and execution today means marketing.
When Sound the Brands first got into the branded podcast space, one of my biggest concerns was that many brands would order some microphones and try to do it in-house and do it poorly, have a bad experience, and dismiss the category. That still can happen, but what seems to be a new concern I have is that brands will instead indeed hire a professional, but still not market it that well, not demand the kind of content that would develop a loyal following, get a lot of listeners, or certainly get the right listeners if it's a targeted project. It's a very tricky category, and there can be bad experiences that tarnish the category, even when people are working with the so-called pros.
Yeah, I think the big issue there is whether they tarnish the brand. And that's when companies will reconfigure their strategies. But we are long past this notion of two mics in a conference room and having a conversation and thinking that the job is getting done. We're just past that for many, certainly in the branded sector, and for many other podcasts. It's just not as interesting as it used to be. So I do think the bar goes up. This thing gets a little bit harder. Especially if you're going to maintain the right image for a brand, with a caveat. So you can find some brands that have interpreted what they do, say on TikTok or Instagram, and I think that's really smart. That iteration has to occur in the branded audio sector as well.
A year or two ago, we noticed many vendors who they might have been hosting platforms or people who are producing other types of podcasts for a living, raising their hand and doing sessions at places like Podcast Movement saying, hey, we're ready to do your branded podcast. And you got the sense that they believe there was some gold to be mined there. Those folks have largely gone away. We don't see as much of that emphasis from people saying we'll do branded and do it very well, but as a sidelight. Instead, what I'm noticing now at Podcast Movement is the big players in the space, the Spotifys, the iHearts, Sirius XM, people like that who are in the deal flow all day, Wondery. They're in the deal flow and they are seeing opportunities for branded. There's no doubt there's more discussion about branded, but it's also coming from the big players in the industry, and they're finding ways to do it either internally or through outsourcing of production, either internally or through outsourcing of promotion and marketing as well. But it's become something that used to be kind of off to the side and a little bit more direct to brand, and becoming more of a big agency, big brand play with big podcast companies.
Yeah, I think, look, brands and advertisers are trying to figure out how to use the podcast medium. Here's one of their pain points. They're used to buying TV and running 30-second ads, and then, the next car commercial comes up. And so they're competing against themselves in the cluster. In radio, you can go 9 commercials deep, and you can be stuck in the middle there. And so advertisers are looking for ways to stand out. And sometimes that's not a 30-second message. Sometimes it's more complicated. Yeah. Sometimes it's about topics that take some time to explain. That's one of the beauties of podcasting, and that's one of the reasons I think they're attracted to the space.
So overall, I think one of the things that all of us who attend Podcast Movement, and congratulations to the Podcast Movement crew on another successful event. There was some controversy there. There's always going to be some sort of thing happening where an event that large, people come away from it with some suggestions and some complaints. And those should be listened to, of course, but they do a great job overall of producing a fantastic event each year. It has become the leading podcast convention for a reason. And I think those of us who go to it each year, we try to take the temperature or maybe check the prevailing winds of the entire industry based on what we see at Podcast Movement. So let me ask you that question. Based on yet another Podcast Movement, how do you see, what clues did it give you about how the podcast industry is changing overall?
Yeah, very good question, because each of these conferences is different. I've seen the evolution, but there are still 2 conferences going on there. There are we'll call them hobbyists, that may not be fair or right, and then there is the big business end. So they're sort of on different tracks, but this was the first time that I've seen all of that coalesce on the business side. I think that the Sounds Profitable conference that was run actually a day ahead of Podcast Movement had about 230, 240 professionals in there. That was the first time I've seen anything like that. I thought that was really smart. I think it worked out well, not just from the presentations that were involved, but the networking with people that are, the vendors that are selling products. So I think that is another really interesting result of this podcast movement. It just feels like the business is maturing a bit. And you also see that on the floor. I mean, look at the number of vendors that were there. There are equipment vendors, to be sure, but there are ad tech and all of those sorts of things that are there. And that's very different than 2-3 years ago. Certainly, and this was my 7th, none of that stuff existed in the early.
So, crystal ball time, which, if you're like me, I hate when somebody asks crystal ball questions, asking predictions for the future. You can pass if you like, but anything that you think Podcast Movement 22 tells us about what we might see in the industry in the near future?
So I come out of the content side. I don't think trees grow to the sky. I know that sounds dark and sometimes, stupid, but I think we're seeing a lot of spending. We're seeing a lot of optimism. I don't want to take anything away from that. It's really important and exciting. But I also think making hits and making great podcasts is really hard. And then having people find them is really hard. And so I think the pain points there will be where we are for a little while. I don't see that as being anything but inevitable, and I think it happens in every business.
Steve, thank you. This has been a fun conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for asking.